Okay, so this is going to be the episode where we're going to show you why we call the epistle to the Hebrews the epistle from hell itself. Episode 5, God is dead, per Hebrews 9 verses 15 to 17. And hold your socks on, everybody. Okay, so we're going to now get into this issue about the writer of the epistle to the Hebrews, which is Barnabas, is going to teach us that God must remain dead. And by the way, this is also in Romans 7 1 to 7, where he talks about once a husband dies, this frees a wife to marry another husband. And so, who is the husband who died? And it starts off talking in Romans 7. He's addressing those people who know the Word of God, know God. So this is addressing Jewish people who are at Rome. This is the consensus. And when he says it's the husband who dies that then frees us from the law, because once the husband dies, you no longer have a legal bond to him. So when Jesus resurrects, it can't be God resurrecting. It has to be God has to remain dead for that principle to apply. So we already know from Paul, what I'm going to tell you is the same thing you're going to read in Hebrews, which is God has to remain dead. So each one of these guys had a different theory of why God has to remain dead. And it's so, Paul, God has to remain dead, so we're free from the law because the person who gave the law is dead and gone. And when a husband dies, it breaks the chain between his wife and him, and there's no law anymore between them. And then Paul says you're free to marry another, and then it's very clear he thinks we can marry Christ. So Jesus takes the place of God. That's Gnostic myth right through and through. You can have same Gnostic myth here in the Epistle of Hebrews, where we're going to learn about what he means by the Testament. So let me just read you this introduction I wrote a few years ago. Not surprisingly, the author of Hebrews has a verse just as strong as Romans 7 1 to 7 that indicates Yahweh God, who spoke to a sub-creator as God, is himself dead. So in Paul's view, you have Jesus being a sub-creator. God delegates to him to create the heavens and the earth. That's what Paul's view is, and it's the same view that you have of the epistle writer of Hebrews. And he likewise believes that Yahweh's dead, but for a different reason, because you can't have a New Testament if the testator still lives. So he says, the epistle writer in Hebrews says, this God Yahweh was the testator who created the New Testament as a legal term in the sense of last will and testament. Now, I've tried to research this. There is no concept in Judaism of having a will. All death, when you died, everything went by virtue of the laws, statutes, and decrees. So it would go to your children in a certain order set by God, not by you through a will. But the Romans had what was called a testament, or last will and testament. So he is relying upon a principle of what? Paganism, to basically give the readers, who obviously are more familiar with Roman civil law than they are with Jewish law, he's going to use that concept. And then it's going to be shocking as we go. Then Hebrews says, this testator supposedly, quote, must of necessity remain dead for the New Testament to live. Otherwise, the New Testament has no strength while the testator lives. So if that testator came back and lived again, then you couldn't enjoy your New Testament. This is Hebrews 9, verses 15 to 17. And then I say we will thoroughly discuss this passage below as corroborating our reading of Romans 7, 1 to 7, to the same identical effect of the fate of Yahweh God as dead permanently so the New Testament can live. Okay, so we will now do that. So I'm going to put this on pause. Actually, I'm going to start a new slide. By the way, before we jump into the Testament issue with the Epistle to the Hebrews, I just want you to see how Christians talk about God Almighty dying. Not Jesus dying, God dying. God cannot die. You know that, right? But Christians somehow believe that because Paul says in Romans 7 that God died, the husband had to die so we could marry Jesus. This is how they view it, okay? So God died for all men, Middletown Church. God died for his creation, Ron Graham. But God died for his enemies, Lakewood Baptist. I mean, they have no compunction of saying God died. Again, these words couldn't come out of your mouth if you had any sense of who God is. God does not ever die. He's immortal, cannot die. Jesus was a man. He can die. His flesh can die. Okay? And that's why he can give his life a ransom for others, because he died for others. He can die, but God can never die. He is immortal. But if you're pagan, like both Barnabas and Paul are in your mind, you're not influenced by the Bible properly, you will teach that in Paul's case, the husband must die, and therefore that will loose the bond of the law, and then you're free to marry another, which will be, you can marry Jesus and ignore the God the Father anymore. And with Barnabas, it's going to be the same thing. You can now just have the testator dies, and then you get to have the New Testament because the testator is dead. So we'll get to that now. Hold on. Wait a minute. I can't help but enjoy this, because there was, the people don't want to ever admit what Romans 7 is saying. So, watch this. So the person is, a commentator is commenting, and he's trying to reconcile, how can the husband die and, we're still, God is remaining dead so that we can marry somebody who doesn't have law for us. So who do we remarry who has no law anymore? Another God? The Paulinist abridges his full willingness to follow Paul's words to their logical conclusion. The Paulinist insists Jesus in resurrection will still somehow represent the God of the Old Testament, who died but simultaneously is a new God. So they realize God shouldn't really be remaining dead, but they realize that if he did really, if God dies and he resurrected, then that would bring back the law. Or if Jesus represents God-Yahweh and he resurrects, well, then that would also bring back the law, because you can't, if you're saying Jesus is Yahweh or identical or one, Jesus' death would not get rid of the law. So the only one who can, so what he does, well, let me read you what he says. Though she, the wife or people of God, may in reality be joined to the same husband, i.e. the God of Sinai, yet in a way he is new, because he died, and ordinarily when that happens, if you want to get remarried, you will need to find another husband. So you see, he's realizing that you literally have to have, somebody has to die to make sense of this, that you can remarry somebody else and get rid of the law that was between you and the God who existed beforehand. So he doesn't want to admit it, but he believes it's the same husband. He believes that it's still God-Yahweh and Jesus as one God, and that's why you can marry Jesus, but he's really in some sense another God or another person. So, and it doesn't, I think he actually says it doesn't line up. So anyway, it's just, this is the incongruities. So the best way to understand what Paul's saying, and the best way to understand what the epistle writer of Hebrews is saying, is God, Yahweh, is the one who died, and he must remain in Sheol. And that's why Marcion was correct, meaning he read Paul and he read Barnabas, and he understood the concept of Paul is that Yahweh is dead. That doesn't mean he doesn't exist or have mental attitudes or a mind, because in the thought of Marcion is that God dwells in the land of the dead, the land of Sheol, and he resides over his people. So he's alive in a dead sense, if that makes any sense. Okay, anyway, so I'm going to put this on another pause here. Okay, I'm sorry. I can't this is another great quote. Again, this is in line with preparing you to understand that what the Hebrews writer is saying. This is John Locke, famous philosopher, commenting on the book of Romans 7 in particular. And he's saying, interpreting Paul, you have been made dead to the law. The phrase here uses to express the freedom seems to refer to the first verse where Paul says, the law has no dominion over man as long as he, meaning the husband, lives, implying, and no longer, rather than to the two intervening verses where he says, not the death of the woman, but the death of the husband sets the woman free, of which more and more by and by. So he is saying that you become dead to the law when the husband dies. But while he lives, the husband has dominion over you. But as long as he dies, it will free you from the law between you and the husband. And Paul is emphatic. He's not talking about the death of the woman. He's talking about the death of the husband, death of God. Okay, so that's I'm going to move on, though. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to keep seeing these gems from this article on Romans 7. So the only logical conclusion about Paul and his view of the husband who dies means that the God of Sinai died when Jesus died, and a different God with a different code of behavior emerged at the resurrection of Jesus. And this is actually supported by John Chrysostom. If you know anything about Christian history, he was considered a major thinker of the 300s. Chrysostom said in the late 300s, quote, that there is nothing, Paul means, against you living with another husband now that the former is dead. Well, God-Yahweh always depicted himself as being the husband of Israel, okay? So now, once he dies, you're free to marry another husband, which is Jesus. Do you see the point? So that's why Paul was saying that the husband must die, and that could only be God. And he dies, and now you can marry another husband, and there won't be any infidelity because the other husband died. So you can marry Jesus because God's dead. You can marry Jesus. Same thing you're going to get out of the epistle-writer of the Hebrews. Hold on. Okay. I'm sorry. I have to keep showing you these very great quotes. So these are leading commentators who realize the problem I'm telling you about. They say it's really Paul couldn't mean it the way it sounds. The main difficulty is that Paul's illustration refers to a wife who is bound to her husband as long as he lives. And in the illustration, it is not the wife, but the husband who dies. The husband, not the husband, but the wife who remarries. See, this is like, who's the husband who died? It would have to be God. You can just read between the lines. They're sick to their stomachs. They realize what this means. Charles Hodge, there is an incongruity between the illustration and the form in which the principle is stated in the first verse. The illustration is that a wife is free not when she dies, but when her husband dies. When God dies, she's free to remarry another person. You see, this is their problem. And they just don't like it. But there's nothing they can do about it because that's what Paul says. Okay, so finally, I'm up to the passage where I'm talking about Hebrews 9:16. Paul's frequent companion was Barnabas. According to Tertullian, Barnabas wrote the epistle to the Hebrews in our New Testament. Later, Jerome and Augustine attributed the epistle to Paul, until the modern era where many simply believe the writer is unknown. There is a passage in Hebrews that similarly implies the God of Sinai is dead, and only Christ lives as the living God. The epistle writer envisions Christ as a distinct God from God-Yahweh, who is now supposedly the dead testator of the New Testament. It is found in Hebrews 9:16. It reads, "For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator." So whoever gives this testament, whoever promises, I'm going to give you this new testament, it means that I have to die for you to get the benefits. When we study this carefully below, this means that the God of Sinai established the promise of a New Testament. And by the way, it's a new covenant, not testament. So he's changed the term materially, because now with the covenant, you don't need God to die. But if it's a testament, you do need God to die, because you can't get the benefits of the promise. Because in a law and testament, in a will, you don't ever get the will benefit until your dad dies, until the person who holds all the goodies, he's got to die for you to get the goodies. But in a covenant, you don't have to have that. God can remain alive for eternity and keep giving you goodies under covenants. So the word testament is a way of cutting off and killing off God-Yahweh, when the word covenant doesn't have any of that implication. Do you see the point? So the word testator was deliberately picked to find something that would get rid of the testator and he's dead, to fit Gnosticism, which is basically we want to have a son who's God and a God the Father who in all his principles and everything about him just can be buried and put away, and he's old and dead and gone. And in fact, he refers to God as dead works. Hold on. But it only means, so let's just read this again. When we study this carefully below, this means that the God of Sinai established the promise of a New Testament, but it only remains alive now as long as the original testator, the God of Sinai, remains dead. Yahweh supposedly reflects now the dead works of the dead law. Instead, the epistle writer means we move on to enjoy the resurrected Jesus, who represents the living God. Okay, so there's a living God versus a dead God. You see? Why would you call him a living God? He's in contrast to the dead God, who is the testator who must remain dead. You see? He's not hiding this. He goes on that the New Testament only persists as long as the death of the testator, Yahweh, remains a fact. So he's not hiding the fact this is a person who dies. Remains a fact. For the New Testament would disappear if the original testator still lives. Okay? And I mean, a Roman would understand when you're talking about a testator who dies and a testator who lives is about a person who has a consciousness who can make a decision that I'm going to give you all these benefits when I die. This must be the God of Sinai who remains dead, because the writer says the New Testament would disappear if the original testator still lived. Hence Barnabas and Paul in Hebrews 9:16 had the identical notion that we read in Romans 7 from Paul. Identical. If Barnabas was the author, then no wonder these two men were common companions. There's no doubt of this interpretation if one reads the entire chapter 9 of Hebrews. It starts with talk of the first covenant in 9:1. Then it speaks of what? Of Christ being come as a high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle. So there's something imperfect. Remember, like in I think I've told you, when you go and watch the movie Tron from 1982, you'll realize that the God who created this computer universe, forget his name, but you realize he's imperfect, and that means he made something flawed, and now he has to pass away. And that's when the son's going to take his place in the story. This is a Gnostic myth made into a movie. So you now will have a more perfect tabernacle, and that will replace the old temple system with a better one. Hebrews 9:11. After speaking of the old temple service required under the law, Barnabas / Paul, some people think he's Paul, so I'm going to put that in there sometimes. Barnabas or Paul refers to pejoratively as dead works. And what is that? The blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Hebrews 9:14. So Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge yourself from dead works to serve the living God. So dead works are works that were required under the law to what God? God the Father, God-Yahweh. But now you're going to purge your conscience from worrying and thinking about the works that the dead God used to want. Now you don't have to do that because they're going to be purged, and they're dead works, and this way you can serve a living God instead of a dead God, if you just do some logical reasoning here. The dead works of the law, this means, belong to a dead system, but instead now you must serve the living God. So he's not hiding much of this, if you ask me. Implicitly, from what follows, this leaves the God of Sinai as a God over dead works and a dead system, in contrast to what is offered by the living God. Now remember, in Gnosticism, God dies and is conscious in a world of the dead, the Sheol. And that's another thing, we don't have this concept, but they did, the Gnostics do, is that you can have a place that isn't hell, but you and I would think it's hell because it's beneath the earth. Sheol is always beneath the earth. And the Gnostics taught that the Jewish people will not resurrect, that Marcion taught the Jews don't resurrect. They go to Sheol, and they will be under the supervision of Yahweh in the land of the dead. So Yahweh is dead, all the Israelites are dead, but they live in the land of the dead. It's a land of darkness and not a happy place, while everybody else gets to go to what essentially is the Elysian fields out in the grass with the sunshine, and everything's wonderful, and we have the living God Jesus and all that stuff. All right, this becomes only clear when we arrive at 9:15-17. Here is the entire passage. Now listen. And this is, let me just see what this is. This is the KJV. And for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament. This gives you a clue. That they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. So there's a first testament, right? For where a testament is, there must also be the necessity, be the death of the testator. So there's this first testament. It's a testament. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise, it is of no strength at all while the testator lives. All right. So here, Jesus is the mediator of the New Testament. The Greek word rendered as testament is diateke, or diateke, meaning will or last will and testament. And you can look that up by going to any article on the Greek word. The fruits from it prevailed were ushered in by the death of the testator. The testament that now lives is the New Testament, but only it has force after men are dead. This necessarily implies that if the testator who died is indeed the same who now lives, the New Testament would disappear and the Old revive, right? If the Old Testator is still around, we would be back under the Old Testator's control and his whatever he's willing to give you while he's alive. But once he dies, you can now take advantage of a New Testament. Or the promise he made of a New Testament to you. I'd make it a little more clear. The New Testament would have no strength at all while the testator lives. So this New Testament goes into effect, or the benefits from it flow only when the testator dies. So the writer of Hebrews, whether Paul or Barnabas, has the same idea as Paul in Romans chapter 7, verses 1 to 7, that the death of Jesus represents the permanent death of the testator of the testament we now enjoy. Otherwise, the old would revive and the new would not live. But since Jesus actually lives, must mean the testator in view who remains dead is only one logical person. It's the God of Sinai, not Jesus. Jesus is alive, so he can't be the testator. The testator has to be God who made the promise. And that's the other thing, is the testator has to be someone who made a promise of something you're going to get in the future once I die. That's the whole point of testament. That's the whole implication of this. The epistle writer of Hebrews can only mean that the God of Sinai made this New Testament as a promise after his death, which now the testament lives because he, the God of Sinai, remains dead. The thanks we give this supposedly dead God-Yahweh, then, per this epistle writer, is we now share life supposedly only with Jesus, the resurrected living God, to whom we now solely focus our attention. And that's why it is important to understand that the epistle writer of Hebrews, Barnabas, really does believe Jesus is God. He's taken those verses that were corrupted by the Septuagint. There was chapter 1, verse 8, where he's quoting, I think it was Psalm 46, where it referred to the Son as God. Remember that? And it doesn't say that in the original Greek. And then he took the next two verses, 9 and 10, he took from Psalm 102, and those said that God addressed the Lord. So another person who was the psalmist, he addressed the Lord as the creator of the heavens and the earth. And so that gave the Son, by mixing all these two passages together, then the Son was the creator of heaven and the earth. So that's why Jesus is in a position now in the mind of the writer of the epistle to the Hebrews, is that Jesus is really much more a God than our God. I mean, the true God. The true God, Yahweh, didn't even create us. Do you know who created us? According to the epistle writer of Hebrews, Jesus created us. God, the Father, only created Jesus. Do you get it? So the real creator of humankind is not God, Yahweh, at all. So just to dismiss him as a dead testator is no big deal, because he didn't even create us. He's not our true Father. He's only the Father of Jesus. So when we say Jesus is, or when people who are the Pauline or the Barnabas viewpoint of things, I don't know if they really think this through, but they would only call God Father in the sense that God was the Father of Jesus, but he's not our Father. So we don't have any allegiance to him because he's not the true Father of humankind. So in Barnabas' epistle to the Hebrews, it's much more clear that the Father did not create humankind. It was by using this mistranslation of Psalm 102, it's clear that the heavens and earth were only created by the Son. And in Paul, it's a little bit different. It sounds like God that the heavens and earth were created by God through his Son. So that could just be a little bit of a little wordplay by Paul to not make it look so obviously heretical. But in either event, the point is that Jesus is more our creator father than the Father is in both Hebrews and in Romans, but it's much more pronounced in the epistle to the Hebrews. And this is why this all fits together very easily for them. It's shocking to most other people because you can't even conceive of people thinking like this. But this is why, unfortunately, if you study Christian history and you study Gnostic history and you study Marcionism, you can see all these things much more easy because you're dealing with it every day. You go, okay, well, I'm trying to understand Marcion. He's got this crazy idea about God lives in Sheol. Why does he think that? And why is there a good God the Father, and then this evil, mean, kind of, unfriendly God, the Father who has to dwell. He did make flesh, but he's gonna go stay forever in Sheol, and the Jewish people live there. And I mean, you got to once you saturate yourself trying to understand these people's crazy viewpoints, and then you read this, it just pops off the screen. You can see it. So if you don't study those things, you're not going to see it as easy. So I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm trying to tell you, the only way you can see these things lots of times is just you have to be lucky. I think you have to be I'm researching one thing over here, and then suddenly I read this and I go, this is the same thing. This is Marcion. This is this Paul only movement of 144 AD. Same doctrine. Where did they get it from? They're reading the same thing I'm reading here. So we have a very strange thing. So let me just see how I concluded this whole thing, because that might be useful to see what the point I got derived from all this. Who knows? All right, hold on. Okay, so you got to remember, I'm examining the epistle to the Hebrews in the context of Romans 7. I'm just showing anybody who's just been walking. I walked everybody through Romans 7 in much more greater detail than I did for you guys. So if you ever want to see that Romans 7 passage, either I'll do a video on that one of these days, or you can go to the website and go look at Romans 7. It's entitled A Major Incongruity. But anyway, so here's the conclusion. In Romans 7, verses 1 to 6, Paul is telling Jewish believers, he addresses them in verse 1, that they are freed from the law given Moses due to the death of Jesus under the law of the death of the husband. Verse 3, the husband has to be God in the covenant declared by Moses. Christ's body by its death made us, quote, dead to the law. Paul's Greek meant the law had been rendered null and void. Thus, the only logical basis for Paul's conclusion that the law of Sinai is void is that the God of the Jews supposedly died when Jesus died. Then, because Paul insists that the law given Moses remains dead after Jesus' resurrection, this must mean that the resurrected Jesus no longer represents that former husband. So if Jesus was still the agent of God-Yahweh, and God-Yahweh was still alive, so I would say this: if Jesus resurrects and God-Yahweh is still alive, Jesus must be the representative of God-Yahweh, right? As long as God-Yahweh is alive, Jesus is his representative. But if God-Yahweh died when Jesus resurrects, he isn't the agent of God-Yahweh anymore, because God is actually dead. And in Paul's view, it's a much more severe outcome for God. He literally means God is dead, like he is not coming back. He's not living in Sheol. It's Marcion who actually is the only person who ever suggests that God-Yahweh can be dead and live in a land of the dead. So I think both of these writers really view that God-Yahweh is dead. The testator analogy or picture and this husband who dies picture are both like God-Yahweh is truly dead and never coming back. He's a dead and gone God. And that's how they come to these bizarre conclusions. So then, because Paul insists that the law given Moses remains dead after Jesus' resurrection, this must mean that the resurrected Jesus no longer represents the former husband. Instead, the old husband, the God of Sinai, must necessarily remain dead as long as Paul's insisting the law given Moses is dead. Okay, right? So if God resurrected and didn't die, then he'd still be a husband in relationship to the people of Israel, and as a husband, the law between them would still be existent. So Paul is trying to break that bond by saying God-Yahweh died, and therefore there's no more law between them. Paul thus must mean Jesus represents, just as Marcion interpreted Paulinism in 144 AD, a new and different God than the God who died on the cross. So again, the idea here is that God was actually living in Christ when Christ died. And so God actually dies at the moment Christ died, and somehow Jesus resurrects. I guess he resurrects himself. That's what I guess, if God's dead. So anyway, there's always little incongruities, but this is Paul's argument, that God has to be dead in order for... Oh, you know what? I just figured it out. Marcion believes the good God resurrected Jesus, because some God had to resurrect Jesus. And remember, he believes in two gods. One is a good God, the Father, and one is Yahweh, who's a stern, tough guy, and he has to be kept in Sheol. So that's that. There is always a solution to every puzzle if you try to figure it out. So my final conclusion here is this. Talking about Paul, but I can say this just as much as about the epistle writer of Hebrews, the epistle from hell, and I think that's just putting it very mildly. What more fantastically heretical notion could be found in any mouth other than what Paul and the epistle writer of Hebrews is saying? Pelagius was right. Paul was reluctant to directly say who or what died. And I would say this too, is you can say the same thing about Barnabas. He doesn't directly come out and tell you Yahweh's dead, but he leaves it to you to go, okay, you're going to have the testator must remain dead. Jesus is the living God. You're going to put behind the dead works of the law. You're going to now, start over with a new living God, Jesus. I mean, so it's left to your implication, because I think they both, Paul and Barnabas, know to actually bluntly tell you, God, Yahweh's dead, might hurt your feelings or make you feel sorry for God, Yahweh, and you might want to think that it isn't so, and you might be upset. And so rather than just put it too bluntly, we're just going to let it soak in. And as long as you just free yourself from the law, that's really the number one thing. We, Barnabas and me, Paul, are going to say is a team. They're team anti-God. That's who they are. Team anti-God, Yahweh. They stick together, and they basically just tell you enough for you to be pushed all the way over and out of any frame of reference that makes you want to follow a dead God and a dead system and a dead law and a dead testator. You want to follow the living God, the living Jesus, the Jesus who frees us from, following God's law and being bound and in bondage, and all these negative terms about everything dealing with Yahweh. It's always negative, always evil, unbelievable. So this is a message from nobody but Satan. These people teaching you these things about God's law, God's message, that he's dead and gone and all this stuff. And this is where dispensationalists, the spirit of dispensationalism is this spirit, the spirit that Paul and Barnabas has sown into their hearts. And you just have to pray for people that they will be one day freed. And I'm hoping some of you listening to this are in that camp. I'm saying this mostly to the dispensationalists, because you haven't heard this in any blunt terms, and you yourself soak it in, you absorb it, you know what I'm saying is exactly how you act it out. It gets into your consciousness, and it makes you change the way you view Yahweh. You view him as a very distant being, somebody who didn't really create you. You don't really care about Yahweh. You really don't have much care for Jesus. Really, you do care and love Paul, and you love his dream of Jesus in the third heaven, but you don't really respect the Jesus who was here. He wasn't that bright. He wasn't that light that he became only after he resurrected and then started communicating with Paul. That's what the dispensationalist mindset is, and I hope by listening to this, if any of you are in that camp, you go, hey, no, I now see it. Paul is evil. So is the epistle writer of Barnabas. These are anti-God people. They hate God. They are the enemy of all that is good and all that God created. These are the enemies These are the friends of Satan and the enemy of God. That's all you can say. And they come from the pit of hell. Let me see if there's anything else. If what Paul left implied were true about the death of the God of Sinai, taking the law with himself into death, then who resurrected Jesus? Well, this is what I mentioned, yeah. So that's, Marcion solved that. There's this other good God that saved him. And by the way, go to our series on Marcionism, where I discuss his view on this idea of a good God, and then the God-Yahweh lives in the Sheol and all that. So we've already discussed that in another video series. All right, everybody. I think I'm going to end the series there. It's kind of a bittersweet ending, meaning this is not my favorite this is not my favorite thing to tell people about, but it's so important that we understand how God allowed a test of us. What's the test? God says, I allow false prophets to test you to see whether you love me with your whole heart, mind, and soul. So by watching this video today, by listening to what these people are actually saying, you should have reached the conclusion that these are people who are not serving God. These people are trying to draw you away from God the Father, trying to insult God, insult his law. And Jesus is the exact opposite. And he's given you the guidance, and now it's your turn. It's now whether you pass the test or not is whether you're going to follow Jesus. You're going to follow God's law. And Jesus said it's an easy yoke. If I had to tell you there's maybe 20 laws on the Gentiles, the sojourners, if you just sat down there and read the law from cover to cover, if you read all 5 books of the Torah, I don't want to say guarantee you, but I'm going to make you a bet you will not find more than 30 laws that mention sojourners or foreigners. So this whole frightening thing where you're going to go to hell if you don't keep 613 laws, forget it. Just sit there, and every time you see the word sojourner or foreigner and there's a law, just highlight it and just go, okay, that's for me. And a lot of the laws are actually antique, so it's like, it's talking about taking care of pigs and farm animals and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah, you can highlight some of those, and they don't even apply anymore to us. I mean, I don't own any pigs. I don't own any farm animals. For example, you got to feed your farm animals in the morning. You can't eat any breakfast until your farm animal eats, which, by the way, God is a very loving God, right? But you know what? I do feed my cat before I eat. I do that because of that law. But you know what? It's not like, there is no commandment that I'm breaking if I happen to, take a grape in the morning before my cat eats her cat food, okay? Because it's not actually in the law. But, they're talking about farm animals doing all kinds of work, so you should make sure they're not starving. So anyway, all I'm saying is, don't over-exaggerate the law. Don't get hung up on that. Follow Jesus. He says it's an easy yoke. He's not lying. You can trust him. It's not that tough to follow God's law, and it's not that tough to follow his commandments. And they're very inspiring and very, very helpful in your life. All right, God bless. I hope that helps everybody. Ciao.